Guys, welcome back. This is going to be part 2 of Unit 2 now. So we left off talking about the different ecosystem services. Now we're going to get into, how the ecosystems are functioning, what they're going to be doing, how organisms are going to survive in them, all that. So the first thing we need to look at is something called the theory of island biogeography. And what the theory of island biogeography studies is basically what influences the number of species found on islands. It looks at it in terms of migration, things like that. So let's assume that we have our mainland here. And then we have two islands, fairly equal distance off the shore. When we look at those two islands off the shore, there's a likelihood that they're going to be able to find immigrants because the birds and things like that are going to be able to fly over and they're going to be able to see it. Now, what they see, though, is that there's a correlation between the size of the island and how many different species inhabit it. Because as birds are flying over, they're more likely to find the larger island than the smaller island. So we end up seeing more biodiversity on the larger islands. The other thing they looked at with the theory of island biogeography is not only how big the island is, but if they put two equal-sized islands further out off the shore and compared them versus the one that's in close to the shore, what they found, I guess this one here should be a big one, so they're equally comparable. What they found was that the one that was closer to the shore, equal size, had more biodiversity than the one that was further away. So when we look, those birds are flying over. They're more likely to find the island closer to the shore than they are further away. So we have more biodiversity the closer into the shore we get. And then we also have more biodiversity the larger the island gets. Because what we see is this one has a low biodiversity compared to this one. But when you compare it to the one that's further away, this one's still going to have a higher biodiversity compared to the more distant island. So what they found was the closer you are to shore, the more biodiverse islands tend to be. The larger the island, the more biodiverse it tends to be. So they ended up coming up with a graph that sort of looks like this. And what it's showing is immigration and extinction. Where the lines cross over are how many species you can expect to be on the island if it is at equilibrium, meaning there's no new species coming in. For every species that dies off or goes extinct, a new one inhabits the area. But they're at equilibrium. So what we see is that our small island furthest away has the lowest number of species. So when we look at the y-axis, this would be sort of like the number of species or the richness of the island. So it's a measure of biodiversity. In this case, it would be species diversity. So when we look at the different island setups, when we look at this point over here, we draw down to the y-intercept and we see that it's the small island that's close nearby. So again, closer you are in, the more biodiverse it tends to be. When we look at this one here, it's the one that's the largest island, the largest island that's closest to us. So when we look at this, if you compare the two equal-sized islands, the large one here, the closer it is to shore, the more biodiversity or immigration rate we have. The one that's further away, again, same size of island, further away, lower biodiversity. That allows us to kind of look at how the species are inhabiting the areas. So again, the main takeaways: closer to the mainland, the more variety of species you have. The larger the island, the more species you tend to have. That's what the theory of island biogeography is. Now, when we look at the different classifications of species, species are broken down into two groups. They can either be generalist species or specialist species. And we talked about this in that last review unit when we talked about how generalist species can survive ecosystem changes much easier than specialist species. So specialist species, again, to review, you guys should have remembered that specialists are the ones that need a very, very specific type of habitat to survive. They can only survive a very narrow range of resources. So when we graph out those resources, we get the niche of a species. So this would be like the number of individuals, and this would be the resources used. So when we graph out a specialist species, there's not many individuals that survive on these resources, almost none. But then we get to that very narrow band of resources, that very specific type of temperature, that very specific type of humidity or moisture level, very specific food source available to them. you get the majority of the population living within a very narrow band of those resources. That's what makes it a specialist. When we look at the generalists, though, now they can survive on a wide variety of different things. So when we graph their niche out, we get a more sweeping, broad, kind of bell curved type of niche. This is still a bell curve, but this is more of what that narrow, overarching graph looks like. So we can see that there's a decent amount of the population that survives over a wide variety of different resources. That's why they survive the ecosystem changes so much better. If I take out this specific resource here, the population just compensates for that. We see an increase in the ones that live off the other resources, and we end up seeing kind of like a double hump to the curve coming. If we take out the ones over here on the other end of it, we would end up with just an overcompensation of the curve. It would look like this. It would just shift over to the left a little bit. That's why generalists are able to adapt and survive those changes. If we take that out for the specialist species, now we have none of the population over here to be able to live still. Again, this is almost a zero number. So if we take out the resources that keeps the majority of the population alive, we end up with just a horizontal line and the population goes extinct. One of the big things that causes this change is the introduction of invasive species. Take a second, pause the video, see if you can remember what an invasive species is. Perfect. Welcome back again. Hopefully you guys have the knowledge in your minds and you remember that invasive species are the species that are not normally found there. So they're species not naturally found in an area. They're foreign. So a lot of times they'll call them alien species. Alien species are one thing because they're not naturally found there. When they start to cause harm, then we start labeling them as invasives. So they're not normally found in an ecosystem, and they negatively affect natural species or indigenous species. So when we look at invasive species, they're the ones that are going to push out the native species from the ecosystem. So if I have a specialist species and I introduce a generalist, again, a specialist, again, no population, then all of a sudden the population exists on a very narrow band of resources. When I look at the invasives, they tend to be generalist species. So if I superimpose my invasive species over top of this, the invasive is able to eat almost all of those resources, able to survive just about all those conditions. So what happens is they're out competing the specialists for their food sources, and what we see is that specialist species gets lower and lower and lower, and eventually it will go extinct. Invasives tend to affect the specialists more than generalists because say that this invasive is, let me get a different color here, I'll put the generalist species in pink here. Let's say that the invasive tends to be eating these food sources here. The generalist species would be just shifted over. So, they're still able to survive and change their conditions. But that specialist, again, has that narrow range of resources that keep it alive, so they get pushed out really easily. And that brings us up to something super important when you look at these niche graphs. If I have two species and their graphs overlap each other, so let's say that I have it like this. Anywhere where there's an overlap of the niche, that's going to be where competition is occurring. Let me draw that a little bit better here for you guys. So we have our first species here. Again, I would say that's probably a generalist species because it has a wide range of resources keeping it alive. Then let's superimpose another generalist species over top of it. In this area here, there's competition for these resources. If that competition is too great, then we start seeing the species dying off and getting pushed out of an area. Again, the other three choices: adapt to the change, migrate to a different area where the change is present, or they end up dying off. So if the competition is low like it is here, they're just going to alter their niches to not be in competition for one another anymore. But let's say that, again, the blue is the invasive. Let's say that we had a specialist species who only ate right here. Now there's going to be competition for those resources that the specialist needs to survive. And it's going to be complete competition. So that specialist is going to be really, really, really stressed out. There's going to be a lot of physiologic stresses on it. It's going to be fighting to find its food, shelter, and water, and all those other important resources. So it ends up going extinct. The generalist just alters its niche. Now, that also brings us up to something called ecologic tolerance. This was a part of a free response question we gave a little bit ago, and a lot of you guys did really well on it, so I think that most of you guys probably understand it. The one thing I want to note with this is the physiologic stress. We talked about how when you're outside the optimal range is where the majority of the population survives, what resources it takes or what range of conditions it experiences to keep it alive because there's little stress to no stress. The stress we're talking about is physiologic stress. That's going to be stress that's put on the organism that's going to alter its survival. So the physiologic stress leads to things like stopping reproducing, stopping growth, because now the body's putting so much energy into just surviving that it doesn't have any extra energy to still be able to do those other things. So if I look, I have a lot of different scales down here. It could be pH, it could be temperature, salinity, available dissolved oxygen, any of those different things. Every species is going to have an optimal range, and that's where you see the majority of the individuals surviving. There's also going to be a marginal range or a marginal niche. That's where the stresses are there, those physiologic stresses that are causing them problems. But organisms can still survive there. It's important to note, though, that here they're not just surviving, but their bodies are growing. The population as a whole is probably going to be growing, and we're going to see reproduction occur. When we start putting physiologic stress on things, that reproduction is the first thing that ceases. So over in here, where the stress isn't as great, it's still a decent amount of stress because there's not many individuals living there. But over here, we have no reproduction occurring. So because of that, as organisms die off, they're not being replaced. When we start getting further into the graph, now the physiologic stresses get really high. And when we start seeing those really high physiologic stresses, now not only are we crossing out reproduction, but they're no longer growing either. The organisms aren't putting on biomass; they're just surviving. When they're in that yellow stress range, they're still growing; they're just no longer reproducing. So we would, strike out the reproduction part. That's why the ecologic tolerance is so important when we're talking about competition and changes in the ecosystem. Let's say that we had a new power plant that got put in an area, and that new power plant is putting out tons of SOx emissions. Those SOx emissions are going to be converted into sulfuric acid, and we're going to see a lot of acid rain happening. As that acid rain falls to the earth, that's going to alter the pH. It's going to shift it down to that acidic range. So when we look at the organisms, they went from being, here in their optimal range without the power plant, before the power plant was made. Now they've shifted over to a new pH, and they're in that marginal niche now. They're experiencing that physiologic stress. As they're experiencing that physiologic stress, they're no longer reproducing. Reproduction shuts down. So that lowered pH is eventually going to kill off the population. It's not going to instantaneously kill them off. It's not like we're dumping concentrated sulfuric acid and pushing them over to the unavailable niche where they're not able to survive at all. They're still able to survive this, but they're not going to grow and reproduce it. So because of that, long term, it's going to end up killing off the organism. That's why we want to remediate it and get that pH shifted back into that optimal range. So pause the video for a second. See if you can remember how we're going to remediate acidity in aquatic zones or acidity in the soil. Good. Hopefully when you guys paused it, you came back to the adding that limestone buffer. By adding calcium carbonate, that neutralizes the acid. So we get into an acidic situation, if we add calcium carbonate to either the aquatic zone or to the soil until the soil with that calcium carbonate added in, the acid is going to react with the calcium carbonate and it's going to shift it back in that optimal range. And the reason why we want to use the calcium carbonate and not a base is because it's going to stop once it gets to that neutralization point, because it's a buffer, not a base. So when we look at bases, if we would add sodium hydroxide, if we added too much, we could end up on the other end and be too alkaline. But by adding a buffer, we're keeping it in that optimal range. So hopefully optimal range of tolerance and ecologic tolerance makes sense to you guys. So what we look at when we are talking about natural disruptions in the ecosystem, it's not just human disruption or anthropogenic disruption. The natural disruptions that happen can be just as devastating for an ecosystem as the anthropogenic ones. So when we look at these, they're going to vary in the rate at which they happen. They can be periodic, episodic, or random. The periodic ones are going to be ones that are repeating and coming back time and time again. Random ones happen, they stop for a little bit, they happen again, stop for random amounts of time, and just keep on going. Episodic are the more sustained ones. They're going to take over a large time frame. So when we look at the episodic ones, those would be things like uplift of mountain ranges, you know, uh, uh, islands forming out in the ocean through hotspot activity. The periodic ones, those would be kind of like the hurricane seasons that we see. Random ones, those would be forest fires, things like that. So when we look at those natural disruptions we've seen changes in sea level. We're experiencing that right now. Throughout the history of the planet, we've had a lot of those different changes in sea level. That's why, if you think back to March Mammal Madness, the thylacine that was in there, it's found on islands, the island of New Zealand and Australia, and there used to be a land bridge that connected it. How the thylacine was able to transport back and forth over those. It's a non-swimming animal that went extinct before humans were in the area. As we look at those thylacine skeletons, we see similar ones on New Zealand and Australia because there used to be a land bridge that connected them. As our sea levels rose, now that land bridge flooded out and the thylacines couldn't mix anymore. Sea level change and climate change are usually going to be linked together. Climate change is another natural one. Don't think of climate change as only being anthropogenic. We're causing an intensification of a natural event with our greenhouse gases we're releasing. If we look at the climate over the history of the world, we had ice ages where the climate went way down. We had periods of warming where it went way up, and it makes that general trend like this. But what we see is humans were first impacting it here after the Industrial Revolution. So these ones were natural back here. It started to raise naturally, but what we're doing with humans by adding carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide to the atmosphere, we're taking it from where it would be naturally occurring, and we're taking it up into that anthropogenic range where it's going up way higher than it should. But climate change is overall a natural thing that occurs. The greenhouse effect is a natural effect. We also have forest fires that happen naturally, lightning strikes, periods of drought makes things more combustible, all those different things. We get storms that come in, hurricanes, tornadoes, all those things. And then we also have long and short-term species migration. If a species migrates out of an area, now the food source is gone. And that happens on the short term with like songbirds that migrate south for the winter. And when that happens on long term, where a species just migrates out of the area and is no longer found there. So the organisms that are left behind are faced with finding new food sources, finding new, uh, uh, prey interactions, all those things. Now, how organisms adapt to this or change as a result of these is adaptation. They're going to gain different genetics to make them more suited to survive that changed environment. Again, this doesn't mean if it's natural or anthropogenic, we cause the adaptation. Adaptation is going to happen as a result of either of those two types of changes. The problem we see is as we're changing it anthropogenically, it's happening at a much faster rate. So the organisms don't have the time needed to adapt. So they're going to be short and long-term adaptations. The more short-term ones are those behavioral adaptations. They're going to shift what they're feeding on. Instead of eating just this food source, now they're going to shift and alter their feeding habitats, or they're going to alter mating habitats as a result of it. But if it's going to be a quick type of change to the environment, a forest fire comes through, a lot of times the organisms don't have the ability to adapt because they're reliant on those mutations to occur. And those mutations, depending on how quickly they reproduce, take sometimes thousands of years to go. And it's always going to be in the form of small changes, not major jumps. We didn't come from being a monkey to a human in one reproduction event. There was slight, small changes throughout the history of time that led to that evolution. Those small changes are those adaptive traits that they're gaining. And again, anytime that they experience a change in the environment, they're going to have three choices. They can either adapt to the change. If they're able to move and migrate, they can migrate away. This isn't always an option. They're not always optional. If you're a plant, for instance, you're not able to migrate. So you're stuck in that area. You're going to be faced with only adapting or dying. If you can't adapt because it's going to take too long or those traits aren't all already in the population, you can't migrate to a new area, you're going to die off. And this is where we start to see extinction happen. And that's why the anthropogenic changes that we're causing are so problematic, because we're making them happen so quickly that the organisms aren't having enough time to either migrate or adapt. They're just going extinct instead. And that's why they think we're in the midst of our sixth mass extinction right now. Now, I'll tell you what, it's 20 minutes in. Let me go ahead and stop this one here. I'll make a third part up with this